My husband died believing I would never uncover his biggest secret. 3 days after the funeral, a lawyer handed me a file that proved our entire marriage had been a lie. I remember staring at the man across the polished oak desk, certain I had misheard him. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 69 years old, and until that Friday afternoon, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I thought I had been a devoted wife for 43 years. I thought I had built a life with a man who loved me. I thought grief was the hardest thing I would ever have to endure. I was wrong. The funeral had ended 2 days earlier. Friends had filled my home with casseroles, sympathy cards, and quiet hugs. They told me Richard had been a good man. They told me our marriage was an example of lasting commitment. I nodded through every conversation because I believed the same thing. Even after all those years, I still slept on my side of the bed, leaving space for a man who would never come home again. That Friday morning, I received a call from Richard's attorney, Harold Benson. His voice sounded unusually serious. He asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. I assumed it was about routine paperwork, insurance forms, property documents, the kind of things every widow eventually faces. I drove 20 miles into downtown Columbus beneath a gray Ohio sky. The entire trip felt unreal. My hands remained tight on the steering wheel. Grief had wrapped itself around everything in my life, turning even simple errands into exhausting tasks. When I arrived, Harold greeted me politely, but without his usual warmth. That was the first thing that unsettled me. The second was the thick file sitting on his desk. It had my husband's name typed neatly across the front. Harold folded his hands and looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said carefully, "there are some documents Richard instructed me to keep sealed until after his passing." A strange chill moved through me. Richard had never kept secrets from me. At least that was what I believed. Harold opened the folder and slid the first document across the desk. I glanced down. Then I looked again. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened, as though my mind was refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Addresses I didn't recognize. Financial records connected to accounts I had never heard of. Signatures. Dates stretching back decades. The room seemed quieter with every page. Outside the office window, traffic moved through the city as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every anniversary, every vacation photo, every promise Richard had whispered while holding my hand. Suddenly, they no longer felt solid. They felt like pieces of a story written by someone else. I looked up at Harold and searched his face for reassurance. Instead, I found pity. That frightened me more than anything. Then he reached into the folder and placed one final envelope in front of me. "Before you open that," he said softly, "you need to prepare yourself. What's inside explains everything." I lowered my eyes to the envelope. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my stomach drop. "For Margaret, the truth you never knew." I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. My fingers felt strangely numb, as though they belonged to someone else. Harold remained silent. He did not rush me. He did not offer explanations. The sympathy in his eyes told me he already knew what I was about to discover. Carefully, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was ordinary. The handwriting was not. I had seen those letters on birthday cards, anniversary notes, and grocery lists for more than 4 decades. "Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and there are things I no longer have the courage to tell you face to face." My chest tightened. Richard had never written to me like that. Not once in 43 years. I continued reading. The words became heavier with every line. He admitted that long before we bought our first house together, long before Daniel was born, he had made choices he never confessed. Choices he believed would remain hidden forever. The letter did not explain everything. Instead, it pointed toward documents inside the file. Documents he wanted me to see only after his death. I lowered the paper and looked at Harold. My voice sounded distant when I spoke. "What is all this?" Harold exhaled slowly. "Richard instructed me not to discuss it until you finished reading." I turned back to the file. The next pages revealed transactions stretching back nearly 30 years. Monthly payments, property taxes, insurance records. The same unfamiliar address appeared again and again. It was located less than 90 miles from our home. 90 miles. For decades, something existed less than 2 hours away, and I had never known. The realization settled over me like cold rain. Suddenly, memories began resurfacing. business trips that seemed slightly longer than necessary, weekend conferences that always appeared at the last minute, holiday mornings when Richard left early because of urgent work matters. At the time, none of it felt suspicious. That was the thing about trust. It filled every gap before doubt ever had a chance. I remembered standing in our kitchen years ago, watching him tie his necktie while drinking coffee. He had smiled and kissed my forehead before heading out the door. I had believed every word he said. Every single one. Now those memories felt different. Not destroyed. Distorted. As though someone had quietly changed the meaning behind them. Harold finally slid another document toward me. You should look at this one. I glanced down. The page contained ownership records connected to the address. My eyes moved slowly across the names. Then they stopped. For a moment, I thought I was misunderstanding what I saw. I blinked once. Then again. But the words remained exactly the same. Richard Collins was listed as the owner. Beside his name was another person. A woman I had never heard of. A woman connected to him for more than 30 years. My pulse echoed in my ears. 43 years of marriage. 30 years of secrets. And somehow, I had only just begun uncovering them. For several seconds, I could not breathe. I simply stared at the name beside Richard's. Eleanor Brooks. The letters seemed to blur together and then sharpen again. 30 years. 30 years connected to a property I had never visited and a woman I had never met. I looked at Harold, hoping there was some reasonable explanation hidden somewhere in the stack of documents. Perhaps a business arrangement. A distant relative. Some obligation Richard had quietly carried. Harold's silence answered before his words ever could. Who is she? I asked. My voice sounded calm, but inside, every certainty I had ever possessed was beginning to crack. Harold hesitated. Then he opened another folder and removed several photographs. He placed them carefully on the desk between us. I lowered my eyes. The first photograph showed Richard standing outside a small white house with a wraparound porch. The picture looked recent, perhaps taken within the last 5 years. He was smiling. Not the polite smile he used at neighborhood gatherings or church events. This was different. Relaxed. Comfortable. At home. The second photograph showed the same woman whose name appeared on the property records. She stood beside him holding a birthday cake. The third photograph nearly stopped my heart. There was a younger man standing with them. He looked to be in his mid-30s. Tall. Dark blonde hair. Familiar eyes. Richard's eyes. I sat back slowly. No, I whispered. That cannot be. Harold lowered his gaze. Margaret, I believe you deserve the truth. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I picked up the photograph and studied the young man's face. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, dozens of memories rushed back. Richard occasionally mentioning a former employee he was helping. Money that disappeared from our savings during certain years. The way he always became defensive whenever I asked detailed questions about specific expenses. At the time, I had assumed he was protecting his pride. Now I wondered what he had really been protecting. Does Daniel know? The question escaped before I could stop it. Harold paused. That pause frightened me more than any answer. I am not certain how much your son knows, he finally said. But there were communications between Richard and Daniel regarding some of these financial matters. A strange numbness spread through me. Daniel, my son, the little boy I had driven to baseball practice every Saturday morning. The young man who called me every Mother's Day without fail. I suddenly remembered how uncomfortable he seemed during the funeral reception. How he avoided eye contact whenever I mentioned his father. At the time, I believed he was grieving. Now I was no longer sure. I gathered the photographs into a neat stack and placed them back on the desk. My hands were steady. That surprised me. 43 years of marriage had just become a puzzle filled with missing pieces, yet I was not crying. I was thinking. And the more I thought, the more questions appeared. Because one thing was becoming painfully clear. Richard had not hidden a single mistake. He had hidden an entirely separate life. And somewhere beyond those photographs, beyond that house and that woman and that young man, there was a truth even Harold had not shown me yet. When I finally left Harold's office, the sun was beginning to set over Columbus. The streets were crowded with people finishing ordinary Fridays, carrying groceries, talking on their phones, hurrying toward dinner plans. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine. For the first time in 43 years, I realized I did not actually know the man I had married. The thought should have made me cry. Instead, it made me think. During the drive home, memories surfaced one after another. Small moments, forgotten moments. Richard receiving phone calls and stepping outside to answer them. Weekend trips that appeared suddenly on his calendar. The years when money seemed tighter than it should have been despite his stable income. At the time, I had trusted him completely. Trust has a strange way of explaining things for you. It fills every empty space with innocent answers. By the time I pulled into my driveway, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The porch light glowed softly against the familiar brick walls of the house we had shared for more than 3 decades. I sat there looking at it. Every flower bed, every window, every room inside carried memories of our life together. Yet now I wondered how many of those memories belonged only to me. Inside, the house felt painfully quiet. Richard's favorite chair remained in its usual place beside the fireplace. His reading glasses still rested on the end table. 3 days earlier, those objects had made me feel grief. Now they stirred something else. Questions. I carried the file into the kitchen and placed it on the table. Then I made a cup of coffee, even though it was nearly 8 o'clock at night. The simple routine helped steady my thoughts. One document at a time, I began reviewing everything Harold had given me. That was when I noticed another pattern. Several financial transfers had occurred on dates that seemed oddly familiar. I pulled out an old family calendar from a nearby drawer and compared them. My stomach tightened. One transfer matched the week Daniel graduated from college. Another matched the year we postponed a vacation because Richard claimed finances were strained. A third appeared during the same month I had sold jewelry from my late mother's collection to help cover what Richard described as an unexpected expense. Suddenly, those sacrifices looked different. I was still staring at the records when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. My son sounded nervous. He asked how I was doing. He asked whether I had eaten dinner. He asked questions that normally would have sounded caring. Tonight, they sounded rehearsed. Then there was a pause. A long one. Finally, he asked a question that made every instinct inside me wake up. Mom, he said carefully, did you meet with Harold today? I stared at the stack of documents on the kitchen table. The silence between us stretched longer than it ever had before. Because in that moment, I realized Daniel was not guessing. Somehow, he already knew exactly what I had discovered. My grip tightened around the phone, but I kept my voice steady. Why would you ask me that, Daniel? Another pause followed. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Harold called earlier, he said. He mentioned you stopped by the office. It sounded reasonable, maybe even innocent, but something felt wrong. Harold had never said he planned to contact Daniel. And if my son truly knew nothing about the documents, why would that meeting concern him so much? I glanced at the papers spread across the kitchen table. Years of hidden transactions sat quietly beneath the warm overhead light. Yes, I replied. I met with him. Daniel immediately asked another question. Did he show you everything? The words landed harder than he probably intended. Everything. Not anything. Not some paperwork. Everything. I closed my eyes for a second. There it was again. The feeling that my son was not discovering this situation alongside me. He was monitoring it. What exactly do you think he showed me? I asked. This time Daniel hesitated longer. Mom, maybe we should talk in person. My heart sank. That was not the answer of someone hearing shocking news for the first time. That was the answer of someone trying to control a conversation. Tomorrow, he continued, Rebecca and I can drive over. Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, had barely spoken during the funeral. She spent most of the reception whispering with Daniel in corners of the room. At the time, I assumed they were grieving together. Now I wondered if they were worried about something else entirely. That sounds fine, I said. Come by around 10. We exchanged a few more polite sentences before ending the call. The moment the line disconnected, the house fell silent again. I stared at the family photographs displayed across the kitchen counter. One picture showed Daniel at age 12 holding a fishing rod beside Richard. Another showed his college graduation. Another showed all 3 of us smiling during a 4th of July barbecue. For years, those photographs represented certainty, family, trust, stability. Tonight, they felt like evidence from a case I had not finished investigating. I returned to the documents and continued reading. Near the bottom of one folder, I discovered correspondence between Richard and a financial advisor. Most of it involved routine matters. Then I found several references to a trust. a trust one had never heard about. The beneficiaries listed were not me. My eyes moved slowly across the page. The first name belonged to Eleanor Brooks. The second belonged to the younger man from the photographs. My pulse quickened. The amount associated with the trust was substantial. More money than Richard and I had ever discussed openly. More money than should have been possible based on what I believed we owned. Suddenly, another realization emerged. Richard had not merely hidden people from me. He had hidden an entire financial future from me as well. And as I continued turning pages, one final document slipped loose from the folder. Across the top was a date from 7 years earlier. Beneath it appeared 2 signatures. One belonged to Richard. The other belonged to Daniel. For a long moment, I simply stared at the signature. Daniel Collins. My son's name appeared beside Richard's on a legal document dated 7 years earlier. The paper authorized adjustments to the trust and acknowledged the transfer of additional assets. I read the page 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood it. I had not. Daniel was not a recent witness to my husband's secrets. He had been connected to them for years. The realization settled over me slowly. That was somehow worse than shock. Shock arrives quickly. This felt like watching a crack spread across a window, inch by inch, until the entire surface changed. I pushed back from the kitchen table and walked into the living room. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the fireplace. Richard used to wind that clock every Sunday afternoon. For decades, I never paid attention to the sound. Now every tick seemed louder than the last. I sat in his chair and looked around the room. Family photographs covered the shelves. Vacation souvenirs lined the mantel. Every object told a story, yet I no longer knew which parts of those stories were true. My eyes settled on a picture taken 10 years earlier during a family trip to Lake Erie. Richard stood with one arm around me and the other around Daniel. Everyone looked happy. I remembered that weekend clearly. Or at least I thought I did. Suddenly, I wondered what conversations had happened when I was not in the room. What agreements had already been made. What truths had been quietly exchanged between father and son while I remained completely unaware. Near midnight, I returned to the documents. Hidden among the financial records was a list of correspondence. Most entries were routine. One was not. An email reference from 6 years earlier mentioned a meeting involving Richard, Daniel, and Eleanor Brooks. My stomach tightened immediately. Not only had Daniel known Eleanor's name, he had apparently met her. I closed the folder and rubbed my temples. The pieces were beginning to connect, but the picture they formed made less sense with every discovery. Why would Daniel keep something like this from me? What possible reason could justify years of silence? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. Daniel encouraging me to let Richard handle financial matters. Daniel dismissing questions whenever I noticed unusual expenses. Daniel reassuring me that everything was under control. By sunrise, exhaustion had settled into my bones. At exactly 10 o'clock, a car pulled into the driveway. I looked through the front window and saw Daniel climbing out of the driver's seat. Rebecca stepped out beside him. Neither looked comfortable. Neither looked surprised to be there. They exchanged a glance before walking toward the front door. It was the kind of glance shared by people who had already discussed what they planned to say. I opened the door before they could knock. Daniel attempted a smile. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Without saying a word, I stepped aside and allowed them inside. Then I placed the trust document on the dining room table and watched the color drain from my son's face. Daniel stared at the document for several seconds before lowering himself into a chair. Rebecca remained standing beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched across the dining room like a wall. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table and waited. After everything I had discovered, I was finished filling uncomfortable silences for other people. Finally, Daniel exhaled. "Mom, I can explain." The words sounded familiar. They were the same words people used when they had been hiding something for far too long. "Then explain," I said calmly. He glanced toward Rebecca before looking back at me. "Dad asked me not to tell you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. 43 years of marriage. Decades of trust. Entire sections of my life built around a man I believed I knew. And now the explanation was that someone asked him to stay quiet. "How long?" I asked. Daniel lowered his eyes. That alone gave me the answer before he spoke. "About 8 years." The number landed harder than I expected. 8 years. 8 years of family dinners. Holidays. Birthday celebrations. Phone calls. Conversations. 8 years of looking me in the eye while carrying a secret that belonged to my own life. Rebecca finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Margaret, we wanted to tell you more than once." I turned toward her. "But you did not." She looked away immediately. Daniel rubbed his forehead. He suddenly looked older than 40 years old. "Dad said it would destroy you." I stared at him. "And you believed lying to me would somehow protect me?" He opened his mouth, but did not answer. Because there was no good answer. The truth sat between us on the table in the form of documents and signatures and years of carefully maintained deception. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. "The woman is not the worst part." My stomach tightened. I had spent 2 days convincing myself I already knew the worst part. Apparently I was wrong. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "Mom, Eleanor was never the real secret." The room suddenly felt colder. "What does that mean?" I asked. He reached into the folder and pulled out a document I had not reviewed yet. My eyes immediately found a date. 27 years earlier. Then I saw another name. The young man from the photographs. Daniel pushed the paper toward me. "His name is Michael Brooks." I nodded slowly. "I know that much." Daniel looked directly at me for the first time all morning. His expression was filled with something I could not immediately identify. Guilt, fear, regret, perhaps all three. Then he spoke the sentence that shattered what remained of my understanding. "Mom, Michael is not Dad's son." I stared at him. Nothing made sense anymore. Every new answer created 3 new questions. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. "And the reason Dad spent 30 years hiding everything is because Michael's connection to our family is something almost nobody knows." He slid the final document across the table. I looked down. Then I saw the birth certificate. And listed in the space marked mother was a name I recognized immediately. The moment I saw the name, every sound in the room seemed to disappear. I stared at the birth certificate, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. They were not. The name printed beside the word mother belonged to someone I had known for years. Not a stranger. Not a hidden girlfriend. Not someone from a distant chapter of Richard's life. It was my younger sister, Susan Parker. I felt the air leave my lungs. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Daniel watched me carefully while Rebecca sat frozen beside him. I looked down at the document again, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They did not. "No," I whispered. "That is impossible." Daniel lowered his head. "I wish it were." Memories rushed forward without warning. Susan attending family holidays. Susan bringing pies to Thanksgiving dinners. Susan sitting beside me at my mother's funeral. Susan laughing with Richard at backyard barbecues while our children played in the grass. I had trusted both of them completely. Never once had I questioned their friendship. Never once had I imagined they shared a secret that stretched back nearly 3 decades. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page. Additional records followed. Hospital information, guardianship arrangements, financial agreements. None of it suggested wrongdoing. None of it suggested scandal in the way I had feared. Instead, it revealed something different. A complicated family situation that Richard and Susan had chosen to conceal. Years earlier, Susan had experienced serious financial difficulties and personal struggles. She had given birth to Michael during one of the hardest periods of her life. According to the documents, she felt unable to raise him herself. Richard had stepped in quietly to help provide stability and financial support. Over time, he became one of the most important people in Michael's life. But instead of telling the truth openly, everyone involved had agreed to keep the arrangement hidden. I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb everything. "Why?" I finally asked. "Why hide something like this?" Daniel looked exhausted. At first, they thought it would only be temporary. Then years passed. The secret became bigger. Dad convinced himself telling you would only cause pain. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. And keeping me in the dark for 27 years was somehow the kinder option. Neither Daniel nor Rebecca answered, because they knew there was no defense for that choice. I looked again at the stack of documents. The betrayal I felt was not about money anymore. It was not even about the hidden property. It was about being excluded from my own family's truth. Decisions had been made. Relationships had formed. Entire chapters had unfolded without my knowledge. The people closest to me had decided I did not deserve to know. Then another thought struck me. Slowly, I lifted my eyes toward Daniel. Does Susan know I have seen all of this? The look that crossed his face gave me the answer immediately. He swallowed hard before speaking. She is coming tomorrow. The next morning arrived far too quickly. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. Susan standing beside me at family reunions. Susan helping decorate Daniel's graduation party. Susan sitting across from me at countless dinners while carrying a truth I never knew existed. By 10 o'clock, I was already seated at the dining room table. The documents remained neatly stacked in front of me. I no longer needed to review them. The facts had not changed overnight. Only my understanding of them had. When the doorbell finally rang, I felt strangely calm. Not because the pain had disappeared, because there was nothing left to fear. I opened the door and found Susan standing on the porch. She looked older than I remembered from only a few days earlier. Her shoulders seemed smaller. Her smile never appeared. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then she stepped inside. Daniel and Rebecca sat quietly in the living room, giving us space. Susan followed me into the dining room and immediately noticed the documents. Her eyes filled with sadness. "You know," she said softly. It was not a question. "Yes," I replied. She lowered herself into a chair and folded her hands together. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "I wanted to tell you so many times." I nodded slowly. "But you never did." Tears formed in her eyes. I was ashamed. What followed was not the dramatic confession I expected. There were no shocking revelations left. No secret romance. No hidden betrayal in the way I had first imagined. Instead, there was something quieter. Years earlier, Susan had faced difficulties she felt unable to overcome alone. Richard had helped her protect Michael's future. What began as temporary assistance became a permanent arrangement. Then came more years, more silence, more opportunities to tell the truth that everyone avoided. Richard convinced himself he was protecting the family. Susan convinced herself she was protecting me. Daniel convinced himself it was not his place to interfere. Each person found a reason. Together, those reasons became decades of secrecy. I listened without interrupting. When Susan finished speaking, the room fell silent again. Finally, I looked at my sister and asked the question that mattered most. "Did any of you ever stop and consider what this would feel like for me?" Her tears spilled freely now. "Not enough," she whispered. "And that is something I will regret for the rest of my life." I studied her face and realized something important. The truth had hurt me. The lies had hurt me. But carrying those secrets had damaged everyone involved. Richard spent decades managing two versions of reality. Susan lived with guilt. Daniel lived with divided loyalties. Nobody had truly escaped the cost. I looked toward the family photographs hanging on the wall, then back at my sister. "I cannot change what happened," I said quietly. "But I refuse to spend whatever years I have left living inside someone else's secret." For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But freedom. The truth had shattered the life I thought I knew. Yet it had also given me something I had not possessed in a very long time. A chance to finally live without illusions.